Los venezolanos podríamos escribir un libro que se llame No vale, yo no creo. Y para empezar, en orden inverso, digamos que a usted le dicen, tú sabes que le van a poner una estrella más a la bandera. No vale, yo no creo. Tú sabes que el hombre va a cambiar el escudo y le va a enderezar la cabeza al caballo. No vale, yo no creo. Tú sabes que el hombre va a acabar con la industria petrolera. No vale, yo no creo. Tú sabes que se va a robar todos los reales de lo que produzca diariamente nuestro petróleo. No vale, yo no creo. Tú sabes que va a agarrar a los militares por las que te conté y se las va a exprimir así, si es que las tenían, y va a acabar con las Fuerzas Armadas venezolanas. No vale, yo no creo. Sí, y le va a meter unos cubanos, y los cubanos vestidos de civil le van a dar órdenes a generalotes, coroneles, tenientes coroneles. No vale, yo no creo. Sí vale. ¿Y tú sabes qué va a hacer? Va a destruir el país. Va a acabar con autopistas, va a acabar con vialidad, va a acabar con la educación, va a acabar con la universidad, va a acabar con la moral del venezolano de a pie. No vale, yo no creo. ¿Sí? Y además se va a embarrar en todo lo que hemos respetado toda la vida, todos los venezolanos, hasta en los peores momentos de los peores gobiernos, si es que hubo algunos mejores que los peores. No vale, yo no creo. ¿Sí? Y además se va a quedar, como lo dijo, hasta el año 2021. No vale, yo no creo. Sigamos creyendo para que nos llamen creyones o huevones.
So 1999 came in and gave us Baby One More Time, The Matrix, and a constitutional reform. As you might remember from the last video, I hope you watched it. Ani! My cat. As you may remember from last video, changing the constitution was the most important part on Chavez's campaign in 1998. And in 1999, well, he was already president, so he didn't waste any time to set his plan in motion. The Constitution of 1961 was flawed, yes. It needed an update, that's for sure. But what is debatable is if we really needed to change it all. I mean, to write a new one from zero, from scratch. But Chavez wasn't interested on updates or amendments. I mean, he was the believer of the new millennium. So he was going to found a new republic and a whole new country, so we had to change it all. This, by the way, was one of the oldest arguments in the Chavista repertoire. It started with the constitutional change. The whole, we need to destroy in order to rebuild. Anyway, he justified the constitutional change mostly basing himself on two key arguments: inclusion and modernization. Now, the old constitution, the one dying, as he called it, it had provisions to change itself, to how to amend the constitution. Everything was provided by it, except the idea of changing the whole document from zero, from scratch. You know, the issue actually raised a lot of alarms, especially among the experts in constitutional law and law in general, but everywhere, because they raised the issue that what Chavez was proposing was basically unconstitutional. I mean, if it's not on the Constitution, then it's unconstitutional. If the Constitution doesn't allow it or doesn't provide for it, then it's not constitutional. The mechanism that Chavez was proposing to change the Constitution, which was a National Constituent Assembly, was not provided by the Constitution, thus it was unconstitutional. You cannot change the Constitution through an unconstitutional method. And And moreover, this institution, the National Constitutional Assembly, would be a supra-constitutional body, which would be a supra-dictatorial body. So that was kind of alarming for a lot of people. But as you can guess, that mattered very little to him. I mean, super-constitutional sounded really good for him, I'm sure. Anyway, the Congress and the courts, to please him, to basically please him and just yield to him, that they decided to allow him to have his National Assembly, his National Constituent Assembly, and let them, I don't know if that is a verb in English, let them write down this new proposal of the Constitution, and then have the population of the people validated through vote, through a referendum, which sounded pretty good for everyone. I mean, it all sounds pretty fair, right? I mean, it's not like we know of any other example of a country that has basically effed themselves after sending to the polls and let the people decide, take the decision to choose or reject something so simple as a new constitution filled with legal jargon that no one understands and that needs to be translated in the courts in order to make sense out of it. I mean, I don't know any other example of people voting for something that wasn't true. But anyway, the race to fill those seats in the National Assembly began, and Chavez twitched the selection process in order to have, to take full advantage of the enormous popularity levels that he was enjoying at the time. And the campaign started full speed. His party and his allies filled the overwhelming majority of the seats, which should mean for somebody who truly wanted to change the Constitution for the right reasons, to make it right, that person would be a little bit worried, because, I mean, the campaign message was inclusion of everyone into the conversation. I want to know everything, the problems of everybody, I need to know them all. So, was everyone except the opposition, because they were the ones who excluded before. Great start. So you see, Venezuela, and I think that is valid for every country that side of the Atlantic, because I'm currently living in France. So that side of the Atlantic, maybe Canada is the exception, but Venezuela has had for a long time a big problem with social inequality. Racism and other kinds of discrimination have always existed in Venezuela. But the root of most of this discrimination, and I can argue with you about that, the root of most of this discrimination was a product of that social inequality. I mean, Venezuelans discriminate each other based mostly on your economic means. If you're whitey, but you're poor, you speak like someone from the barrio, the slums. I mean, if we can see that your clothes are, you bought them in the street, like the street vendors, and not in like real boutique, like a store or like a mall or something like that, you're gonna be treated as shit, regardless of how white you are. And the same, I think the reciprocate is also valid. Like, I don't recall the fact of being dark-skinned much of a conversation topic when said person was famous or wealthy. I mean, like, in a discriminatory or derogatory way. Yes, there were plenty of token characters, like, the black one, the gay one, the Chinese one, but in Venezuela there's a token character for everyone, basically. So, based on that real and undeniable reality, Chavez started courting those who felt excluded and those who weren't, but felt like that was a real issue, and finally somebody was doing something to try to solve it. Now, I find it funny nowadays when I see people, especially Venezuelans, talking about inclusive language, because Spanish is a patriarchal language, since by default, for many words, especially the plurals, you know, the default is masculine. Chavez thought so too. So his solution, his proposition was, instead of changing the words like people are talking about it now, which is ridiculous, he just broke the plurals into both masculine and feminine, so both will be written down on paper. And that's where we got such beautiful phrases like todos y todas, juez y jueza, reos y reas. But voila, exclusion solved, right? He also advocated for the rights of indigenous people, which in itself would be something that would be actually remarkably redeeming, because yes, indeed, they were the real excluded ones. I mean, in Venezuela society, there was nobody more disregarded than the indigenous communities. We were taught about them in school like they just disappeared after the Spanish came. You know, when from my hometown, like 500 kilometers away, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, indigenous community in Venezuela still lives. It's alive and has a culture and has absolutely an amazing history, and I didn't know about them until one family member told me to stay away from them because they were all barbaric and I should never trust them. So yeah, that was a real issue as well, and I objectively cannot dish on the articles that they added to elevate and protect the indigenous rights. In fact, most of the constitution is actually better than the one from 1961 regarding mostly social rights and social advancement, which was labeled by them as social justice, which I absolutely hate, because there's absolutely no thing like social justice. The concept doesn't exist. But that will not be debated on this video. What will be, though, it's the merit of changing the structure of the mechanics of the state to achieve such social justice, which, by the way, was one of the favorite mottos of early ordinary Chavista on the street. Because you see, there were some key changes, some minor, some pretty major, but all of them key. First of all, we have to get rid of the Senate. Why? Because it was all corrupted. Okay, but wait a minute. Can we just find another way to solve the problem of corruption in the Senate without actually eliminating a whole institution which served as a counterweight to the executive branch? Well, for Chavez and his followers, no, it wasn't. So they proposed to go from a bicameral system into a unicameral system. That will save us money too. Okay, what's next? The old provision to keep people too comfortable in power. Yes. You see, after so many years of dictatorships and sectarian violence in the country, the Constitution of 1961 had a 5-year term limit for presidents with no immediate re-election possible. The logic behind it was that way no man or party could settle for too long on the institutions in order to, begin to sequester all of their power, This fell, of course, because sectarianism between parties in Venezuela is something that exists ever since the very concept of party got to the country. I mean, there are so many parties in Venezuela that were created because of this. I didn't win an internal election, I'm founding a party. I feel entitled to be the leader, I'm gonna found a party. Rafael Caldera wasn't the first one. This, of course, allowed the culture of corruption to take hold, because one administration would try to invade as many key public posts possible so they could keep helping their parties to stay in power. And if they lost the election, they will usually find a way to siphon resources away before leaving. This didn't happen in each and every individual case, of course, but it was widespread, and it was almost expected from our elected officers. Well, they're gonna steal. We know they're gonna steal. So I find that we can have a debate about how changing the president's term from 5 to 6 years and allowing an immediate re-election would help to cope with that problem. I mean, I think we all can understand how with more time and more power, the problem would actually get worse. Can you guess what happened? But their argument was that we needed it because it was the lack of policy continuation which was ruining the country. Right. And then we get to what at the time it seemed cosmetic, but turned out to be also a key part of the playbook. We needed to change the name and the symbols of the country. We were no longer to be the Republic of Venezuela, we were to be the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The flag needs one extra star, and we're gonna justify it because the Guayana province eventually came into the independence camp, even though at the start they were siding with the Spanish. And then the shield of arms, in which we have a horse who looks at the past, looking at the past of the heroes and the ideas of the independence. No, it needs to look straight ahead to the future. This was hotly debated everywhere by the opposition, and not because, oh, I don't want to have an 8th star. That's what Chavistas thought the problem was all about. I mean, one of the key problems is that every single governmental document, seal, stamp, etc., everything would have to be changed. And that would cost a ton of money, which would be kind of ironic coming from a government that minutes ago just told us, oh no, we're just here to cap reckless spending and corruption. But I mean, Chavez was still riding his wave of popularity, so the arguments of the Chavistas was that it's not a big deal, it's only a word. And we're doing it because we are creating a new country and we need to build a new man for the new country. Now, I hope that phrase let you understand why it was a big deal after all, what they were trying to do. So the draft has finished after 6 months or so, and suddenly copies of the little blue book were on the hands of everybody. The project was to be approved or rejected via referendum, which was settled for the 15th of December of 1999. And then, as if we were really on a film, or as if there was really like a hand of an angry biblical God, tragedy struck, and it struck hard. The night of the 14th, it started raining, like really bad, and it was everywhere in the country, like north of the Orinoco River, everywhere was raining. This was very weird because December is usually a very dry month in Venezuela, but not only that, not only the rains were off season, but it also, they blasted the country continuously all night. They dropped about like 2 meters of rain in only one night. I'm talking about hours. 2 meters of rain in hours. So the mountains literally began to crumble downhill, and there were landslides and floodings everywhere. I mean, everywhere in the country there was devastation all over the country, but nowhere was hit harder than the Vargas state, which is basically a thin strip of land sandwiched between the sea and really tall mountains. Several towns literally disappeared from the map, and the worst part of all is that 20 years later, we still don't have a concrete number of people that are dead or missing. But Chavez pushed through with his referendum anyway. And honestly, I think it was the beginning of the shedding of his sheep's clothes, because he started complaining that the media was fabricating stories to make him look like a jerk, like he didn't care about the people, like he was drinking with Fidel or with Fidel Castro, etc. You know? So yeah, before fake news, we had Chavez, and what he did was rubbish. He won. Of course he won. In spite of all the people who lost their houses, their businesses, their family members, he celebrated before starting the reconstruction charade. The Vargas tragedy was indeed a huge tragedy for the whole country, including my family, because literally half of them lived in Vargas back in the day, and they still do. So indeed it was a tragedy for everyone but one man. We'll see why in the next video. I hope you join me then.